Hi everyone, this is Nick, and welcome to Carantocracy. Today I'll be reviewing the comics works of Alan Moore. I have been a fan of Alan's since I picked up a copy of Watchmen later in college. Before then, I hadn't really read comics or been a fan of comics. I've devoured most of Alan's comics works since then. He's also been a gateway to other comics writers and other, comic books. And I imagine that is a common story for people who have been exposed to comics through Alan Moore. I will be tier ranking the majority of his material. I tend to collect trade paperbacks, so that'll be kind of the way that these things are sorted. And as much as possible, I'll try to give my thoughts on the collections themselves, in addition to the work inside them. This is Alan Moore, so there's not going to be a lot of material in the bad category, but I'll certainly try to cast a critical eye when it's necessary. So starting right off, Alan Moore got his big break in 1980 writing for 2000 AD, a British anthology of science fiction stories. So I'm kind of skipping over a lot of the juvenilia from before then, but this is where I think his really relevant work begins. So Future Shocks were short stories, often with a twist in the Twilight Zone mode that appeared in that anthology series. And Alan Moore had a number of these over the course of the early 1980s that he had written. Some more memorable than others. Certainly one of the more famous or memorable ones is The Reversible Man. And this really left an outsized impression on me when I first read it. Basically, a man ages in reverse, and it's only 4 pages. I was really astonished when I flipped back through this book for this video to realize that all of the emotional ground that he was able to cover in just 4 pages here. Incredibly poignant and incredibly memorable. Another notable work that appeared in 2000 AD as a short story is Chrono Cops. If the art looks familiar, it should. This was Moore's frequent collaborator, most memorably in Watchmen, Dave Gibbons. And this is a very twisty story in typical Alan Moore fashion. Albernad Snaz, I believe is the name, was also, Abelard Snaz was another serial short story that was written by Alan Moore for this, and highly comic and amusing. Overall, this is a pretty good start. Like I mentioned, some of these works are more memorable than others, and but I think on average it's a very solid beginning. For me, this is a solid B tier ranking for Alan Moore's Future Shocks. I believe there are several different ways that this is collected. I have only seen this version. To my eyes, it's a pretty good reproduction in terms of the artwork, and I think this is a reasonable copy to get your hands on. Next, we have DR and Quench. This was also written for 2000 AD and published serially, so these are all short stories, and they feature the hijinks of a duo of rapscallions who happen to be aliens, and all the adventures and misadventures that they are involved in. I hadn't heard a lot about this before reading it. I think in terms of Alan Moore and his humorous writing, this is a bit underrated. And personally, I find this the funniest that Alan Moore has been. There's a satirical edge, but he certainly doesn't let that overwhelm the humor. It's just laugh out loud at times. I would also rank this in the B tier. And again, this is a pretty good compilation of that work. It also features some additional stories featuring, I believe, Alan Davis Alan Davis and Jamie Delano in the writer's chair. But the majority of this is Alan, and it is his complete work on this story. Next up, and another 2000 AD collection is Skizz. This was written in response to the upcoming, at the time, E.T. movie. He was requested to come up with something that would, work off of the popularity of Steven Spielberg's E.T. And again, I think this is a very strong work. Lovely pencils by Jim Bakley, I guess, and just beautifully paced in terms of the story and the story beats. There's a lot of humor here, the fish out of water, with Skizz as he meets humans, a good bit of satire on the human condition, too, from his perspective. So it's just a wonderful blend of humor, commentary, pathos, and it does tell a complete story. Perhaps a bit slight, and again, indebted to the original E.T. in terms of concept, if not in story beats. But again, I think this is one that I would recommend, and one that's not really regularly heralded in terms of Alan Moore's work. So this, for me, also would be a strong B. So the last 2000 AD material that I wanted to cover is one that does show up in terms of top 10 lists, and that is the Ballad of Halo Jones. So this is a story about a woman set in a post-apocalyptic future on Earth, and essentially she falls into different adventures, escapes Earth, goes on to space travel, and so it's basically an adventure comic following Halo Jones. Personally, I was underwhelmed when I first read this. Unlike a lot of the other shorter works here or serialized storytelling, I had a hard time getting into it. Some of that does have to do with the writing itself. It kind of throws you into a different lingo and slang, and the first couple of pages are fairly inscrutable. So a lot of obtrusive dialogue, slang. And then the character herself, I did not find entirely appealing. A lot of things happen to Halo Jones rather than her being the initiator of events. So in terms of autonomy in the storytelling, I just didn't find her a very engaging or compelling character. Also, this seems to be the most popular way that these stories have been reproduced. So originally, I believe, in black and white. These are in color, which I did appreciate. But like a lot of the other 2000 AD, these weren't initially published in the standard U.S. Paperback form, so it's slightly different dimensions. So on the reprints, though, they shove them into the standard paperback dimensions, and so there's a lot of landscape here that's just been wasted, and I just find it visually unappealing. This is also something that I think could probably have been condensed into one paperback, but probably for the purposes of making a little bit more money, that wasn't done. The most interesting collection of the Halo Jones is probably Volume 2, and I think a lot of that has to do with the surrounding characters, and then in terms of the storytelling and some of the twists, there are some very unusual and more memorable twists as far as the storytelling goes. And then this continues into a Volume 3. This was supposed to go on for, I believe, an additional 6 volumes, but there was a bit of a fallout with 2000 AD, and so this was not completed. It does end on a fairly... it's a fairly suitable ending, so it doesn't leave you with a huge cliffhanger or anything like that. So in terms of ranking Halo Jones, I would put this in the C category, so probably a low C for me. So moving on, we're still in early Alan Moore, so this is the 1980s. Another publishing house that he wrote for was Marvel UK, so this is an imprint based in Britain, and he wrote several short stories for Star Wars magazine published by Marvel UK. These have been recently reprinted in 2 standard comic book issues, so you can get all of Moore's Star Wars short stories here. And I largely enjoyed these. Probably the most memorable, Dark Lord's Conscience, features Darth Vader in a game of skill and mines, and has a very memorable ending. And then, different stories featuring a number of the classic Star Wars characters. So, nothing, I'd say Dark Lord's Conscience is the most memorable, but the other ones are certainly nothing to slouch about, if less memorable. So I would give these also probably a solid B or C. I think I would go with a B here. Another Marvel UK offering, and really a prototype for a lot of what Alan Moore does with comic book characters, is Captain Britain. And by that, so he picked up a slagging comic book superhero property and basically reinvented and deconstructed it. So within his first issue or two, he's killed off the lead character, Captain Britain, who's remolded and reshaped and into something different. A lot of really nice characterization here. You can see the evolution of his storytelling confidence. There's a really great villain, a fearsome villain in the Fury here. And some really nice secondary characters. And, Captain Britain is surrounded by, as I mentioned, a lot of colorful and memorable characters. And then as this story continues, things get a little bit more experimental. There's some really beautiful artwork provided, I believe, by Alan Davis. Yes. And just very entertaining. Probably not as perfectly paced or as ambitious as some of his later superhero work, but as a herald for Watchmen, for Swamp Thing, and this concept of deconstruction that he's so famous for, I think it really gets things off to a strong start. And this is actually the first one that I would put solidly in the A category. So again, not as strong as some of his later superhero works, but this is definitely something that is worth rereading. This collection here that I found a little difficult to find collects his entire Captain Britain run, and again, it's beautifully reproduced here. And for me, this is the way to read it. Night Raven, also produced at Marvel UK. This is my only exception to focusing exclusively on his comics work. So again, he's writing in the superhero mode. Night Raven is a character in the vein of the Spirit, but this is prose. It has illustration by Alan Davis once again, and essentially, it's a series of short stories, and I didn't realize this until the second or third story, but it is a story that builds up. This is not all Alan Moore. This has a number of writers. His work is probably about 50 to 60 pages of the entire book. So here we go. So this is all of Alan Moore's work here, but it's a pretty engaging story. I'm not always a fan of Alan's prose work. But in this case, because of the hard-boiled detective series, some of the purple prose really kind of adds to the story and the atmosphere, and certainly those types of stories tend to overblown descriptions anyway, so it certainly fits the material in this case, and it's got a pretty interesting ending. So if you're interested in Alan Moore's prose work or his early superhero work, this is one to pick up. And I would rank this probably B tier. So the other anthology book that Alan Moore wrote regularly for in his early British period was Warrior, and this has several of Alan's strongest material, I believe. So Miracle Man, not a lot needs to be said. but certainly its reputation is deserved. So, even though Captain Britain preceded it, anytime we think of superhero deconstruction and the precedence for it, Miracle Man is, kind of first on the list. So once again, taking a property and twisting it on its head, I kind of avoid spoilers here, but he takes the character of Miracle Man, who has a long publication history and has some twists that are both really compelling and quite poignant as they're carried out. So both in concept and in execution, it's incredibly well done. So one thing to comment on, there have been different paperback editions. There was a recent edition published by Marvel that does not actually have Alan's name in it. I believe it's credited to the original writer. I prefer the paperbacks, mainly because I'm not at all interested in the back matter that basically covers half of the material. It's basically the same amount as the actual material. So from just from a collecting standpoint, I don't like to have all that extraneous stuff. But the reproduction it's easy to argue, is better. So let's try to find. Yeah, here we go. So comparing the two, I do think from a legibility standpoint and from a coloring standpoint, I do prefer the hardcover. The other advantage of the hardcovers here, and just take a look at Kid Miracle Man. So again, I think there's a slight edge in the recoloring of the hardcover edition. The other advantage of the first hardcover, at least, is it contains the time warp stories, which I did not really enjoy, but in terms of completion, that is an advantage. So this was collected in a total of 3 books, and then book 4 followed Neil Gaiman's take on the character. So here's book 2, and certainly this is not a superhero comic for children, and Alan Moore took advantage of his ability to to write explicitly adult material in terms of violence. There's a birthing scene that I'll skip over here, but quite graphic, although perhaps not gratuitous in its depiction. And then things get really crazy in book 3, and he takes the idea of superhero as God to its natural extreme, and probably some of the most memorable writing here. And this unfolds over the course of, I believe, 6 or 7 years, as Alan Moore is doing other things. But things really escalate and get very dramatic in the 3rd act here. And also includes, without spoilers, one of the most inventive and harrowing suicide scenes. So someone commits suicide by writing a note, not documenting it, but the actual note itself is the suicide, and just one of the most clever and inventive things that I've seen in a comic story. So Marvel Man for me, A tier. The only thing that would keep it from being S tier for me, some of its pacing, as it's serialized, felt a little awkward at first. Again, you can actually see his confidence as a writer grow throughout the course of the story, but that is one thing that keeps me from putting in that S tier category. I think for someone interested in superheroes to begin with, it's great to recommend, but I don't think it's necessarily for everyone. Another famous Moore story that started in Warrior and then moved on to be published by DC in the Vertigo line is V for Vendetta. So this was drawn by Dave Lloyd. A really unique art style. more consciously tried to avoid a lot of the tropes of comics writing at the time. So this mostly consists of dialogue, trying to avoid, a lot of the purple prose and a lot of the exposition captions that he relied on for Swamp Thing, for some of his other comics work. And I think that really works for this story for the most part. There were times with the stylized drawing and the reliance on using dialogue to progress the story where I think legibility was a little bit sacrificed. And I think also the characterizations of the villains in particular did suffer a little bit, and partially I think because of the stylized way of writing and the focus more on the V character and EV character, the comeuppance of the villains at the end of the story was a little weakened by the fact that I didn't feel like I had gotten to know them terribly well. So there are some weaknesses in the storytelling, some weaknesses in the experimental approaches that both Dave Lloyd and Alan Moore take. But I think for the most part, this is a dystopian story that compares with a lot of other 20th century dystopian fiction. And I would have no problem comparing this alongside something like Brave New World, like 1984, in terms of inventiveness, in terms of its commentary on society. I think it's a very strong work. So for me, this is a tier, slightly above Captain Britain, but probably not quite to the triumph of Marvel Man. The last warrior collection that I have here is the Jeffrey Saga. And this is Alan Moore in a comedic vein. It reminded me a lot of the Addams Family, so we're following a family of eccentrics and monsters and how society around them deals with them. This story starts off really well. There's basically we follow a tax collector as he goes and investigates this family and some of the suspicious activity going on, and has a really hilarious sequence where he is transformed into petunias. There's also a really strong story involving Raoul, who is a character, a werewolf, and a lot of the misunderstandings and comedies of errors that go along with that. As the story progresses, though, I found it less engaging and with diminishing returns. And then he came back to write a follow-up and kind of tie-up story, I believe in the early 90s or late 2000s. And I found the satire a little leaden. It focuses a lot on daytime talk shows, and a lot of satirical targets that I think got outdated very quickly. And so I think, as I said, it's diminishing returns. About halfway through, I was kind of anxious to get over with it. So not as strong as some of his other entries here. Still very readable for the most part, especially the early work here. I would lump it into kind of the low C category, so C minus category. So I'm going to pause from going strictly chronologically at this point and look at a couple of the anthology works that are available for Alan Moore. So we've got Brighter Than You Think here and The Extraordinary Works of Alan Moore. So Brighter Than You Think collects 10 of his short stories ranging from the 80s to the 90s, and some very, very strong work here. So Love Doesn't Last Forever, In Pictoria, The Mirror of Love, The Bowing Machine, This Is Information. These are all, in my mind, essential Alan Moore, if you are a fan of his work. So Love Doesn't Last Forever. Probably Moore's most famous short story here, In Pictopia. Now, the thing about this collection, it does suffer in the reproduction, especially In Pictopia. I'm not sure if the camera can pick this up, but it's such a dark reproduction that it makes it a bit difficult to read and to make out. Now, it does preserve the atmosphere here, and I do like the coloration, but I wish it were just a little more legible. And then each story it also features an essay by the compiler of this work, Mark Sobel, and I think he does a pretty reasonable job of contextualizing Alan's work here, and those are engaging in their own right, and their own reason for recommending this. This is The Bowing Machine, again one of the more stylized and very memorable of the short works in here. So I think this is a very strong collection. In terms of anthologies of Alan Moore's short story work, I would put this up in the B category, probably solidly B, I would say. And then the extraordinary works of Alan Moore. So this features samples of different Alan Moore stories, and it's essentially one long interview. So if you want to get inside the mind of Alan Moore, he's a famously loquacious interview, but they basically go through his entire career with samplings throughout his career. In terms of Alan Moore interviews, this is one of the strongest, and for that on its own, again, I would highly recommend this work. It also features some reproductions, another reproduction of In Pictopia, and this is one that I wanted to show for comparison. So different ways that this is reproduced, and in this case was recolored. So, certainly some different choices in terms of the coloring here. The title sequence here and the colorful superhero characters really pop. And then moving to the next, I think it does suffer from the nice subtle coloring of the original, and now it's more grayscale, and I prefer the coloring here, but certainly from a legibility standpoint, this is preferable. But I think it really depends on your taste. But it's nice to have two different views of this seminal work. So this one also, I think for an Alan Moore fan, is a very interesting collection to have. I would also put this in the B category. Next, we're going to transition to Alan Moore's classic DC period, and to my mind, his greatest work, which is Swamp Thing. So Alan Moore took over Swamp Thing, again, a lower tier character for DC, and famously recreated the origin story for Swamp Thing in the classic tale, The Anatomy Lesson. So the wonderful thing about Swamp Thing, and I know some criticize its drawing as a bit of the era, which is certainly true, but does not, in my opinion, suffer for it. One of the things I love about Swamp Thing is the chance to really, draw nature at its finest. And just some beautiful sequences and coloring here. But in terms of innovative storytelling, really nice serialized but standalone, but satisfying in terms of a standalone story, I don't think you can beat Swamp Thing. And there's so much ground that he's able to cover with it. And throughout this, we hit on superhero work, we hit on ecological fables. He covers space. He covers science fiction. He, in one of these volumes, he satirizes the newspaper comic strip Pogo. It's just Alan Moore at his most creative, firing on all cylinders, as well as a creative team, Stephen Bissett and John Totleben, who are just right there with him in terms of the artwork. And it's just so satisfying, and it's something that I've reread multiple times, and just invites those rereadings. And every time you forget how the story unfolds, and it surprises me every time I do. This has been recolored for the new Absolute editions. I haven't had a chance to look through those, but I think the coloring here is really nice. And the way that it's produced with kind of a cheaper newsprint, I think really complements the aesthetic and the now vintage looking style. So this is collected in a total of 6 paperbacks. Got Batman making a feature here. One of his more experimental stories, both narratively as well as in terms of art style towards the end here. And you can sense his restlessness in some of the later stories and his readiness to kind of complete this story. But really, there are no weak Swamp Thing stories. He ends strong, and how beautiful the artwork. And again, for me, this sits as the apotheosis of Alan Moore's comics work, and I couldn't recommend it more highly. When you're competing for top Alan Moore stories, I think some of it is a matter of taste. I do like the lengthier storytelling with Swamp Thing, and again, the ability in the short story format to be able to cover a lot of different ground and a lot of different types of storytelling. That being said, in terms of a singular storyline and in terms of graphic novels, this is undoubtedly his best, and one of the great graphic novels of all time. Working with Dave Gibbons, and I forget who the colorist is here, John Higgins. I just remember reading this, and it's 12. It's a 12-issue series, and it feels like you've read a Russian novel when you complete this thing. It's so dense, incredible the amount of detail that Dave Gibbons is able to pack into his 9-panel grid structure here. But just beautiful. And then one of the things that, and I believe this is kind of Alan Moore's first real foray into including significant back matter as a critical part of the storytelling. And he just knocks it out of the park here. All of the back matter is engaging and moves the story forward, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful story in every way. I could understand Watchmen as your favorite Alan Moore. Again, I think it's a matter of taste. For me, Swamp Thing edges it out just as a matter of taste. But these are both superior works. And certainly S tier. There are several different trade paperbacks collecting Alan Moore's DC short story work, and each collects different stories. Unfortunately, so there's one that skips out The Killing Joke. There's another that includes some of the Wildstorm material that didn't feel particularly cohesive with the rest of the material in here. So to my mind, the best one to collect is this one right here, DC Universe, The Stories of Alan Moore. So this collects, again, his 1980s DC work. So we have his classic Superman stories, his work on Green Lantern, Vigilante, and then, of course, it also collects his Batman stories, both Mortal Clay and The Killing Joke. In terms of Alan Moore's short story work, it's unimpeachable, and I think that the strongest that it ever was. So you have For the Man Who Has Everything, which is probably the strongest Superman story ever written. The Green Lantern stories, which I don't really know a lot about Green Lantern, but I found these really, really engaging and, just really kind of doing a lot with the, with the short number of pages that they have. Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, another excellent Superman story. Mortal Clay, and then The Killing Joke, which I do appreciate having it in this form and with this coloring, the carnival coloring that has since been recolored, I think to its detriment. Not one of Alan Moore's strongest works, and certainly in terms of his early 1980s work, kind of the cruelest and the most misanthropic that he would get in that period, and just really not to my taste. But certainly in terms of its storytelling and a lot of it, the devices it's used and definitely its influence on the character of the Joker, it has an outsized influence in Batman mythology. And understandably why when you read it. Again, it's even though I don't necessarily care for its themes or what it has to say about the world, it's definitely a storyteller who's mastered his craft. So for me, if you're going to own one Alan Moore collection of short stories, in terms of all of his short stories, this is the one to get. And for me, this also is S tier. I think anyone can pick this up and appreciate what he's doing and appreciate the storytellers and the characters that he's writing. So before we kind of get back to things chronologically, I did have a few that I wanted to cover kind of randomly. The first is at Maxwell the Magic Cat, which was rarely a Alan Moore drawn as well as penned comic. So this was a comic strip that he wrote that I believe was weekly under the nom de plume Gilda Ray, and also drawn by him. There's not a lot here. He's definitely writing in the vein of Garfield, and a lot of the tropes that Garfield uses are used here. He does attempt some satire and some criticism of the newspaper comics medium itself, but doesn't really work, and it's just not a pleasant read because the drawing style is so primitive, and he never really evolved as a draftsman or as a drawer of comics. Certainly, he is well placed himself as a writer rather than a comics artist. And then the forward by Eddie Campbell, I found a bit petty. He tries to compare Maxwell the Magic Cat to Garfield, and to Snoopy, saying Snoopy mouths a conveyor belt of soothing platitudes. And to me, it's someone who really doesn't have an understanding of Peanuts or the comic strip as a medium rather than the comic book. And I don't want to say a lot about Alan Moore and what his thoughts are on the classic newspaper comic strips, but you get the sense that he doesn't have a lot of love for them, and as he does for the comic book medium, and I think that really shows here. And again, this is stuff that honestly I prefer Garfield over. Not his strongest work, but certainly interesting, to read. Being that it is Alan Moore, but for me, this belongs in the D category. These are a little bit hard to find, a little bit expensive. In my opinion, probably not worth the purchase. This is one that I decided not to actually put in the tier ranking because it's not actually an Alan Moore script. It was scripted, I believe, by Jamie Delano and a few others. But it was based on an Alan Moore story concept that they did republish here. Basically the creation of this comic strip, which purports to be the world's longest comic that was drawn in a single day by hundreds of artists in Britain. The conception and the concept behind the story is a lot more interesting than what actually ends up in the book. So, kind of as an artifact, as something unique, it's interesting, but not a very interesting or engaging read, I would say. And I feel like I've got a couple critical takes in a row here. So American Flag, which was a 1980s comic book Howard. I'm sorry, I do forget the regular writer of this book. But in any case, Alan Moore wrote a backup feature for this book, lasting about 8 issues or so, and then the story completes in his final issue here, heavily satirical. And kind of making fun of the sexual mores of Middle America. Again, certainly not badly written, but Alan Moore in more of his cruel or kind of vicious satirical mood that just isn't to my taste. So this is one that I would also suggest would be a skip. And this was never formal. This storyline was never formally collected, although probably in totality it'd be around 50 or 60 pages, or certainly something that could warrant a trade paperback, but not one I would probably buy if it did become collected. So another late 80s story from Alan Moore, and him writing in a very different mode than what he normally does. So no superheroes. This is very social, writing in kind of a social realism sort of way. The main character, who is dealing with a crisis of conscience as an artist in a corporate environment, and then rediscovering his old self. You get the sense that a lot of this is autobiographical by Moore. Some really nice art from Oscar Zarate. I apologize for mispronouncing that. And probably one of Alan Moore's more underrated stories. This is one I've only read through once, but would certainly like to return to again. And I think really Alan at his most earnest and vulnerable, I would say, as a writer. But again, something that I think is worth picking up, and just for the art on its own, but a story that holds up pretty strongly. I don't really want to say more about it than that. So for me, this would edge up in kind of the B+ tier. So moving on, we have Brought to Light. This is Alan Moore in his first work with Bill Sienkiewicz, who would go on to write the couple of issues of, to write the couple of issues of Big Numbers that we have. And you can see why Alan Moore wanted to do more with him. It's just a beautiful painting that Bill Sienkiewicz has done here. So this is only half of the book. The other half is done by another artistic team, and essentially it's about the discovery of what the CIA had been, I believe, published by the Christic Institute. So, some of, and this is really the first deeply researched nonfiction work that we see from Alan Moore. He really does well in that mode with From Hell and the heavily researched Providence that we'll get to here in a little bit. That being said, for this work, it's very polemic. You basically have a monologue with the American Eagle character who represents the American military. And I'm not a big fan of the polemic style, and I feel like in terms of the research here, it relies almost exclusively on the material released in the Christic Institute. So I think that this is important information, don't get me wrong, in terms of its political and historic significance. But I find its tone and the way that it gets those harrowing facts across, not to my taste. Certainly the drawing outpaces the writing in this case. For me, this is another D tier, although probably just kind of edges out of the C tier category. So the first of Alan Moore's big unfinished works is Big Numbers, also by Bill Sienkiewicz. And of any of Alan Moore's unfinished works, this is the one that I think most often about what it would have been like to have the completed series. So initially set as a 12-issue series, published in this unusual 40-page issue, square style, and just figures some astonishing artwork by Bill Sienkiewicz, and some really interesting writing and dialogue by Alan Moore. There's a lot to say here about its comment on relationships, on the limitations and sometimes futility of language itself to convey things. And then again, another strong social realist work. The whole setting here is the building of an American-style shopping mall in effectively Alan Moore's hometown. Now, it is a fictitious place, but it is meant to be the town that Moore grew up in. So just some really wonderful drawing, some really nice writing. And again, Alan Moore writing in a way that is a bit different from other things that he had done in the 80s. You really see him stretching himself and attempting new things. And it is unfortunate that it wasn't completed. You can read issue 3 online, and he, in terms of the narrative, he had it completed, but obviously did not finish writing it. For me, it's tough to really assess its place in a tier list because of its incompleteness. But I think for fans of Alan Moore, it's unique, and it's just an interesting book to think about and to speculate on what could have been. For me, it would end up being in the B tier category. And the last of Alan Moore's 80s classics, in terms of starting in the 80s, this one took him, I believe, a full decade to complete. Was bounced around several different anthology series, and that's From Hell. I think this is just a fantastic book in terms of marrying theme and writing style with the perfect artistic companion. Eddie Campbell, I think, is very stylistic and kind of an acquired taste, but for some reason with this material, in Victorian style and that newspaper scratchy ink style, it just works amazingly. The other thing I was really impressed by learning was, after reading this, was just over how long the book had been written and drawn. It's so stylistically cohesive. It's amazing to think that this was in so much flux, and that there was a question that might it even be completed at some point, because it feels of a piece. It feels like it was written as a graphic novel. One of the strongest things Alan Moore has done. I like his approach here as opposed to Brought to Light, where he's not beholden to being completely factual and sort of suffering from having to to play things completely straight and factually. He really runs with things here, does a lot of speculation, a lot of fantastic elements that, because he's not really trying to depict what truly happened here, he's allowed to get away with. And it's understood by the way that the storytelling is that it's not dishonest. It's finding, it's kind of seeking its own truth about the matter and the mystery of Jack the Ripper. My version does come with a companion that was mostly written by Eddie Campbell. Does feature some drafts and some of the storyboarding by Alan Moore. I flipped through this. For me, because the back matter here is so extensive and just so exhaustively detailed in terms of the influences and inspirations behind this, that I felt that that was sufficient, and that this was kind of nice, but not essential, and probably not something that I would go back to. So on its own, the graphic novel, one of the best things that Alan Moore has written. Doesn't quite hit the tier for me that that Swamp Thing or Watchmen does, but unquestionably a superior achievement. So after the 80s and after Alan Moore's attempts to to write in the big two, the DC and Marvel, and having the outs with both of them, and then self-publishing, he got back into the superhero business with Image in the early 1990s. The first thing that he wrote for them was the superhero story 1963, which is basically a retro superhero comic story that was set over 6 issues and then was supposed to end with a big 80-page annual. Another Alan Moore piece that never saw its completion, and one that I really am not terribly interested in knowing how it ended. So for me, there's a lot of attention to detail and a lot of care in these stories, which are both written and drawn to mimic classic comics of old. So Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, a lot of the old Marvel styles are used here, which is kind of obvious from the drawing here. This is one of my more favorite short stories out of this series. And the attention to detail, so even the advertisements, the letters page, the comments here, everything is done to mimic that style. So here we have Al's Amphitheater, in which our peerless pontiff provides the puzzled populace with penetrating pointers pertaining to peace, pep, and the pursuit of piety. My problem is it essentially runs in that vein through all 6 issues, and for me, it's not pleasurable to keep reading. It felt like a one-note joke that continued for 120 pages. The artwork is beautiful. It's certainly nice to flip through. But I feel like a lot of times Alan Moore condescends to the material or mocks the material. And a lot of times it doesn't necessarily feel as loving as I would hope, that it satirizes it more than really, tries to invoke the spirit of those inspirations. And so, for me, it got tired, and I can understand why the final annual wasn't continued, because I imagine the joke got old for Alan Moore too. This is one that I was fairly disappointed by, and it's not, in my mind, really worthy of a reread. For me, this would fall into the D tier category. And continuing with Alan Moore's Image work, he wrote for Spawn, and this gets a lot of mockery, but I actually enjoy this more than his work on 1963, and I think some of it is probably expectation. I wasn't going in here expecting a lot. I don't know a lot about Spawn, the character, and honestly, even after reading all of Alan Moore's take on it, I still don't quite fully understand who he is or what the character actually is. But there's a lot of humor, and there's a lot to be entertained by along the way. So he wrote as early as the 8th issue, and probably if you're going to pick up any Alan Moore take on Spawn, this is the most interesting and strongly written one. So I don't believe it actually features the character of Spawn, but it does feature demons in hell who are torturing people. It was my introduction to Violator as a character, someone that Alan Moore obviously enjoyed writing about or writing for, and just kind of a joyful psychopath. and kind of a really, an amusing character to look at and draw, both in his demonic form and in his human clown form. But again, if you're okay with Alan Moore slumming it a little bit, if you're okay with kind of low stakes, just going along for the ride, pulp, fiction style, I think this is something that you might find yourself enjoying more than you really thought you would. And he went on to write several other single issues, Blood Feud, which one of the less interesting of Alan Moore's take on Spawn. But then we get to the Violator series. So there's Violator as the clown, and this is really where we kind of let loose with comedic violence. And the Violator character. I think the only available trade paperback collection would be the collection of his Violator and Bad Rock story. And this also, if you kind of leave your brain at home, is pretty amusing in a very comic booky way. There are a lot of times where it doesn't even feel like Alan Moore writing. It's kind of surprising that, and I'm curious what kind of mindset he was in when he was doing this. But again, from an entertainment standpoint, not terrible. I would give his Spawn material probably a solid C. And then Alan Moore's first really classic collection from the 90s with Image is Supreme. And unusual in that, really, rather than a deconstruction, it's a reconstruction of a superhero. So in Image Comics fashion, Supreme was an uninteresting, ultra-violent Superman, basically a Superman without a moral compass. And from what I understand, not a very good book prior to Alan Moore coming in. Alan Moore came in and basically decided, well, why don't we try to reinvent him as Superman for the 1990s? And came up with the idea of the Supremacy, a clever meta concept where every single version of Supreme from the past 60 years in his invented chronology is present and then engages with the story. There are criticisms about, I've read criticisms about the artwork from the regular cabal of Image artists. I really didn't have any problem with it. The production is a bit grainy and looks like it's probably just photocopied rather than from original art. So the reproductions from Checker are not great in that way. But again, if there's a collection, I prefer that over the floppies. So I have these. Probably if you want to read the art in its best form right now, it would be finding the original single issues. But these are not terrible. And again, I was able to kind of overlook some of the bad reproduction, and it's just a really enjoyable story. And here you see, artists writing in the old, 1950s comic book style. And it kind of seamlessly moves back and forth between this old style and then the more modern, 1990s version of the character. And really builds to an interesting conclusion over the course of the initial 12 issues here, I believe. Chris Sprouse, a regular collaborator with Alan Moore in America's Best Comics, does show up here in Supreme. I believe these are the first things they worked on. His issue writing is really lovely, and this is probably a highlight from this book. And it's basically two characters sitting in a room and talking, and then the flashbacks. And it sounds like such a boring concept, but there's so much tension and so much drama within that conceit that it just works. Just very entertaining and just lovingly characterized. I think Supreme holds up with any of Alan Moore's superhero work. And then he continued writing for it for another 10 issues or so. It was supposed to be another 12-issue arc, but it was aborted midway. And so it does end on cliffhanger, but it's still worth it. Doesn't quite reach the height of the story of the year, but still very entertaining and still very solidly written. So in terms of collections for Supreme, these two paperbacks do cover most of the work, but there are a few things that were not collected. And so in some of the single issues, there were some short stories that were not finished, or that were not included for whatever reason in the paperbacks. And then, even though the story was discontinued, Alan Moore had another issue written, and that was ultimately drawn by Eric Larson and published a few years later. And so it continues the story of the return one more issue. So it doesn't complete the story, but if you're itching for a little bit more, this is well worth picking up, and you can get these pretty cheap on eBay. So I'm going to stop here. I think that this is probably a pretty natural place to take a pause. So certainly to get trying to get through Alan Moore's comics works comprehensively is a pretty daunting task. The man is prolific. He's worked over many decades. So if this is something that you find interesting, let me know. I do plan on continuing with part 2 to complete his later 90s and then through to his recent retirement. So just let me know, and I'm planning on doing that soon. So thank you for watching.